Hey, what's up? This is Twisted Mind, and you're watching the First Look series, an overview of the changes made to your class going into the Mists of Pandaria. Monks of all specs can bring the 5% stat boost through the Legacy of the Emperor. Windwalker monks, that's the DPS spec, bring the 5% raid-wide crit buff through Legacy of the White Tiger. And Brewmaster monks, that's the tank spec, bring the weaken blows debuff with their keg smash ability. All monks get a taunt ability that also increases the running speed of whatever you just taunted. All monks get an out of combat res. All monks get a 2-charged resource free ability called Roll for mobility, recharges every 20 seconds per charge and modified by talents. The monk version of Dispel is called Detox. It now removes poison and diseases. For other monk utility, monks have an ability called Paralysis, which is kind of like a Ret Paladin's Incapacitate, meaning that any damage will break the effect, but do note that the effect is doubled the duration on a target if it's cast facing the target. You can use Disable on targets in melee range. It's kind of like a hamstring, and it'll permanently refresh itself to the 50% slow movement speed if the target stays in melee range. If you do it twice in a row, you'll also put a root on that target. Disable has no cooldown. You have a 1-minute disarm on an ability called Grapple Weapon. It's a ranged attack, but here's the catch. If you catch a better weapon that you're stealing when you disarm your opponent, it actually gives you a damage boost or a less damage taken boost if it's a good shield. These benefits and the disarm last 10 seconds. Spearhand Strike is the monk's interrupt. It's on a 15-second cooldown like the other melee classes. It locks the school out for 5 seconds when you interrupt, but if you are facing the target, it will actually global silence all schools of magic for 4 seconds. In terms of survival cooldowns, all monks have access to a 3-minute fortifying brew, reduces the damage you take by 20% and increases your health by 20%, lasts 20 seconds, and can be modified by glyphs. You also have access to Zen Meditation. It's a channeled ability, another 3-minute cooldown, reduces all damage you take by 90%, and it redirects the harmful spells being thrown at your raid for its 8-second duration to you for 5 spells. This can be glyphed to be channeled while moving. Now for the nitty-gritty of how this class actually works. Basically, you have 2 resources to juggle. You have energy, and then you have these combo points on yourself called chi. Essentially, what your rotations, regardless of spec that you're going to be juggling, is you're going to be spending abilities that will generate chi, and then you're dumping that chi off on other abilities. Here, I'm demonstrating that Jab is your primary ability that costs energy. Every time you jab, you generate chi. Now, I'm in this stance of Fierce Tiger, which makes my jabs generate extra chi, so it does 2 instead of 1, so just note in this stance that jab will give me 2. I can then choose to dump this chi 2 at a time into Blackout Kick, basic straightforward damage, 2 chi per, or for 1 chi I could put a stacking buff on myself, stacks 3 times in this Tiger Palm ability, and that buff causes me to ignore 10% of the enemy's armor, and that buff lasts 20 seconds. And essentially all rotations are going to be juggling your energy versus juggling your chi. Or instead of energy you have mana if you're spec'd Mistweaver. All monks have access to an execute called Touch of Death. Costs 3 chi, but that can be modified with a glyph. And it's on a 1.5 minute cooldown. Essentially, if the target is at less HP comparatively to you, you instantly kill them. It can't be used on other players. Before talents and a specialization, monks all have access to 2 forms of AoE. Path of Blossoms will allow you to poop out these little flowers for every 1 second for 3 seconds, cost 30 energy. Note you can't actually create them within 3 yards of one another, so you want to be on the move while you're pooping these out. You also have Spinning Crane Kick, channeled ability. It's 40 energy. Essentially, it's the one that's still being tweaked numbers-wise, so expect it to change, but it generates chi if it actually hits 3 targets, and if you're tanking, you'll still continue to dodge and parry. And do note that it does slow your movement speed by 30% while you're channeling. The movement speed penalty can be modified with a glyph. Monks have a unique ranged ability called Crackling Jade Lightning. No cooldown, 20 energy per second. It's a channeled ability. Essentially, you can channel this thing, and it has a chance to generate chi. I think it's 25% chance. And the weird thing is, if if someone runs up to you in melee range while you're channeling it, they will be knocked back, but that's an 8-second cooldown. Monks are a hybrid class, and they do have 2 heals as a baseline. 1, you can drop these healing spheres for 60 energy apiece. It's the same targeting reticule as the Druid's mushrooms are, in that you can click the ability once, and then you can spam click all 3 at charges if you want. It also gives you a buff to show how many charges are remaining if you want to add that to your power auras. You have to have missing health for your allies to get restored heals from this, and do note that your allies can suck up those heals to themselves if they run over it. And you also have this Expel Harm ability. It's on a 15-second cooldown and it generates chi, and if you are within melee range while you use it, it does do damage equal to the amount of healing that you're doing to yourself, and you can get other heals from talents. When you learn Windwalker, you'll get a few abilities, but the primary stance stays the same as Tiger Stance, unlike the other two specs I'll talk about in a minute. So there's no confusion as to which stance you should be in, because you're always going to be forced into the one with extra damage and the extra chi generation. I'm showing the funness you can do with this flying kick. 25-second cooldown, you just run through the air and hit the first thing that you hit, and it slows when you land. But for other cooldowns, you have this 1-minute energizing brew. It'll give you energy, so try to maximize that when you're energy starved, because it's a 1 minute, you want to be using it frequently. You also get another survivability cooldown called Touch of Karma. Costs 2 chi, 1.5 minutes, and you can redirect all the damage you're taking over 6 seconds to the enemy instead of yourself. You also have a mini cooldown called Fists of Fury, 3 chi, it's a channeled ability, and on a 25-second cooldown, you basically pummel everything in front of you for these rapid strikes, and you also stun everybody for 4 seconds while you're channeling this ability. You can glyph for this to also have a 100% parry chance, but you gotta be facing the targets in order to have that parry be effective. It also functions as an AoE and divvies up if there's multiple targets in front of you. You're going to be using Jab primarily to generate your chi, and also note that you'll randomly proc these power auras. That's actually your mastery. When you jab, you have a chance to instantly proc either a free of cost blackout kick or a free of cost tiger palm. Other cool passives you get are when you parry, you get a chance to increase your parry, and remember that parry for all monks will backlash and strike the target that you're facing. And if you do manage to kill an enemy with your blackout kick, you have a 50% chance to summon a little chi sphere, and the objective in this spec is to maximize your chi dumping abilities, so this is a DPS increase for getting those last hits in. You'll still be dumping off your chi with blackout kicks, and it's also incredibly critical, in fact the #1 priority in your rotation, to keep that tiger power stacked up to 3. And the second priority in this rotation after keeping that buff up is actually dumping off either your Blackout Kick or Tiger Palm whenever you get a power aura proc from your mastery. Now check out what Blackout Kick is doing here. If you're facing the target, it does give you a mini heal, and if you run behind the target, it actually puts a dot on the target, does 20% of the damage that your kick did over 4 seconds. It's also okay to munch these kicks into one another because that dot actually works like Ignite, so it's not like you're losing DPS by mashing those Blackout Kicks back to back to back. And you'll also notice that there's another kick in addition to Blackout on your bars for speccing Windwalker. Rising Sun Kick does more damage, and it applies your Mortal Wounds, so your Mortal Strike debuff to the target. It's on a fixed 8-second cooldown, and it increases the damage that all targets take by 10% within 8 yards for 15 seconds. So essentially, you're going to want to try to mash this button off cooldown in order to maximize your DPS. One more thing you'll notice is that you have this new buff stacking on yourself. The way this is happening is you have a passive. Every time you dump 4 chi, you get this stack of Tiger's Eye Brew. You can dump off all these charges, goes up to 10 at any time with your Tiger's Eye Brew, and gives you a buff for 15 seconds that increases your damage by 2% per stack of brew that you just dumped off. So this is why it's so critical to maximize your chi dumping abilities in this rotation, is because you want to try to get that as close to a high uptime as you can, and you want to try to dump it off with as many stacks as you can. It's also a skill cap measure because you can try to dump it depending on like what temporary buffs you might get from trinkets or weapon enchants procs or something. Or if you know that there's a part of the phase where you need that extra burst DPS, it's also good for PvP for stacking up and switching, or for fast target swapping, or for focusing your burst. A question you might have is, how does this work with your mastery? Even though your mastery is making your abilities cost no chi, it still adds stacks of Tiger's Eye Brew if you're dumping off 2 chi at a time, so your mastery is not going to affect that Tiger's Eye generation in any way. It will actually help it because it's essentially just free chi. And there you have it. That's basically all of the abilities in your rotation. Simply put, you want to maximize your hit and expertise caps first. Your haste is the next best stat, and crit isn't that far behind haste. And it says that mastery is the worst, but they're still tweaking with it, so I expect it to be a little bit more balanced closer to launch. Basically, you want to keep your Tiger Palms up to those 3 stacks. Don't ever let that armor penetration buff fall off. You want to use your Mastery procs next. Then you want to use your 35 talent, whatever you chose. It's a chi dumping ability. Then you want to use your Fists of Fury channeled cooldown, and then you basically want to maximize your kicks. Rising Sun first, and then Blackout for if Rising Sun's off cooldown, and then jabs, and then you want to be using your Tiger's Eye Brew. It's a 15-second duration. You need to use that intelligently. So sometimes it full stacks, sometimes not. The rotation should feel fast because all of your abilities are already capped at a 1-second global cooldown. Your range rotation gets a small tweak because you can actually dump that chi that you're generating from your lightning with these little spinning fire blossoms. If they go a certain distance, 10 yards, it actually does like root the target and the damage does go up. They are random, like they'll just go to random enemies, but you can actually get it to target the enemy that you have targeted with a glyph. The spec is fast and fun, just don't cap out on energy and don't cap out with too much chi. And let's check out Brewmasters. First thing you know when you learn Brewmaster as a specialization is you actually get another stance. Your Ox stance that you're going to be standing in for most of the time is going to reduce your damage by 25% and increase your energy regen by 30%. It reduces the chance to be crit, and it increases your stamina by 20%, and it allows you to stagger this damage, but I'll get to that in a sec. For new buttons, you get this Clash ability, causes a target to rush at you, and you meet halfway and you stun the target. It's a cool variation on charge. For some new cooldowns you get, for one, you get this ability called Avert Harm. It's kind of like the Prop Pally raid wall, but you cause all the damage that's being done within 10 yards, 20% to be redirected at you, and it can be staggered. I'll get to stagger in a bit. And your Fortifying Brew has actually been buffed up a bit. It takes an additional 20% reduced damage from your stagger, so I'll get to what stagger is. And also notice that the energy cost has been removed from your interrupt. Now you have this really short cooldown, it's on a 9-second, called Elusive Brew. And what it does is it increases your dodge chance based on how many stacks of this Elusive Brew that you have up on yourself. Elusive Brew is generated by auto attacks critical strikes, so you don't really have a whole lot of control over it. However, it can stack up to 15 times, so you can pool it if you need be, but I would just keep it as close to the 9-second cooldown as possible. And then your other mini cooldown that you want to be using frequently is called Guard. That actually costs chi, but it is on a 30-second, so you can use it pretty liberally. And it's just a simple shield that you put up based on your attack power. Now for these new buttons in your rotation, you'll notice you have this ranged attack that you can throw down. It's called Dizzying Haze, and it puts a debuff on the targets and it causes a lot of threat. If a target's affected by Dizzying Haze, they have a chance to blow themselves up. It's only a 3% chance, and it does a slow. Now, you can use this ability by itself as a ranged puller, however, this Dizzying Haze debuff is actually baked into this ability. So if you're in melee range, just use Keg Smash, essentially, because Keg Smash, in addition to putting Dizzying Haze on the group, it also puts up your Weaken Blows debuff, and it generates 2 chi. It'll generate 2 chi, which is, you'll see how important chi is for this spec in a minute. So essentially you only want to be splitting up and using that Dizzying Haze to pick up stray ads if they're running at you or on the pull. You could use Expel Harm in the other specs, but it's really critical in this spec to be using as close to cooldown because it does generate 1 chi, and keep in mind that in order to generate the 2 chi that you had in the other spec, you had to be in the other stance of the tiger. And since you're an ox, it only generates 1 chi, but the most important role here is staying alive, so you want to be using this as close to cooldown as you can for that heal, because any healing that you can do is closer to keeping you to staying alive. And then last but not least, you want to be using jabs if those other 2 abilities are on cooldown to generate your chi. Something that's unique about this spec, Tiger Palm, you remember how it used to cost energy? Well, it doesn't in this spec. Essentially, you can keep it up 100% uptime with no stress or hassle except for using up a spare global. Theoretically, you do want to maximize your DPS by using it, so you do want to try to keep it up at 100% uptime. However, what you really want to do is use it with Guard, because if you use it 3 times, you'll get this buff, and that buff will increase it'll increase your Guard absorption by 15%. So you want to be trying to refresh that 3 times before you use your next Guard, because you notice they're both 30-second duration and Guard's a 30-second cooldown. Also, you notice as I'm attacking this dummy here, all my attacks have a chance to summon these little spheres. This is unique for Brewmasters. These spheres can't be seen by other players, and it can't be used up by other players, so they're exclusively only used for you. When you do pop your guard, you do take extra healing, so you can control using those spheres for the extra burst of heal if you need to. Now for dumping your chi, here's where it gets really critical and plays a part in your active role of mitigation. Blackout Kick now does this extra thing. When you do use it, it puts up a 6-second little buff that increases your parry chance by 20%. So you want to have that 100% uptime with it because of the parry, but it also increases the amount of stagger that you're doing by an additional 20%. And I'll get to stagger in a minute, but essentially you want to maximize that uptime as close to 100% as you can. The other thing you can dump your chi off into is this Breath of Fire. It's a little cone of AoE. You can, it leaves a lingering dot on the target, but you can also glyph for it to do a disorient, so it has a little bit of survivability attached to it if you glyph for it. And do note that the dot only goes up on the targets if they're affected with that dizzying haze, but since you should be using it to keep up your weakened blows debuff, then it should always burn the target no matter what if you're doing a rotation correctly. However, keep the Blackout Kick buff on yourself up as a priority in this little mini rotation. And then your other chi dump, like I said earlier, was Guard. Guard's the mini 30-second cooldown that you can drop off that chi on that you should be using a little bit more liberally. Now all those abilities use 2 chi at a time. There is one more thing you can use to dump your chi off, and it's called Purifying Brew. It has a 1-second cooldown. Now, it's going to instantly purify all of your staggered damage. And finally, what is this staggered damage? Okay. Basically, when you're in Ox stance, as a default, you will take 70% of whatever is hitting you. So this means that tanks, like Brewmaster tanks, are going to be taking the most damage out of any of the tank classes. Now, 30% of that damage, instead of taking it up front, gets staggered over the next 10 seconds as a lingering dot on yourself, and that dot can refresh with Ignite mechanics. This Purify button just clears all staggered damage, and then you saw earlier that there are modifiers with your shuffle to change that stagger damage. Instead of being from a 70% upfront 30 staggered, even closer to like a 60-40, it varies up depending on the buffs or your mastery levels. So the way this works out in your UI is when you're taking damage, you'll go into these levels of staggered, and it will try to color them based on how much damage you're taking. If it's light damage, it's colored green. If it starts to get heavier damage, that dot gets more powerful on you, it turns yellow, and then if it's a really heavy dot, it turns red. So you can kind of gauge when to purify off that damage based on the color of that lingering stagger dot on yourself. And you can see now why I said earlier that chi generation is really critical, because it's basically tied to your active mitigation, is how much chi you have, because you can't control the randomness of elusive brew. So this is the way that you're going to stay alive. So you want to be intelligently using this Purifying Brew, Blackout Kick 100% uptime, and you also want to be using your level 30 talent, whatever you picked, for staying alive as well, and Guard. Smart management of these abilities is what's going to keep you alive. And also note for chi generation here, I'm using Spinning Crane Kick instead of jabs. One last thing I want to mention about this effect is the Summon Ox Statue ability. It's a 30-second cooldown, and you can summon this statue that stays up for 15 minutes. This is the reason you want to be doing max damage in this spec, is because if you're doing max damage, it'll be casting this Guard ability on raid members. So it's good for your group to just be doing max damage, and it also interacts with Provoke in a strange way. It causes an AoE taunt based on the area of wherever you place it, so smart placement will help with AoE taunts for stray ads. And you can also glyph for an extra ability called Leer of the Ox, which basically does an AoE slow, and it also causes the targets to attack the Ox, so it's good for getting saving your life if you're getting overwhelmed. So this spec in the right hands will do pretty well for itself, but you need to know what you're doing. When you learn Mistweaver, you'll note right off the bat that you get a new stance called Stance of the Wise Serpent. It increases your healing done, and it replaces that energy bar with a mana bar. So this spec does revolve around mana, and you do get 50% of your regen from Spirit through this new mana as a resource. You also get a few cooldowns. This first one you'll notice, Life Cocoon. It's a 2-minute, and it places a cocoon of chi energy around a target and absorbs damage, but it also increases the periodic healing they take. And this spec primarily is periodic healing, so this is pretty good for like a tankish sort of cooldown. And we also get this bananas powerful spell called Revival. It's a 3-minute, and it basically is a mass dispel. Like, it'll completely dispel everything that Detox would normally dispel, which includes magic in this spec, and it just does an instant super heal. So, and because it's an instant cast, you can do this while on the move. It's really powerful, given the right circumstances. Now you sort of have the same basic 3 heal structure that all healers have, like a slow cheap cost, a big expensive one, and a very fast expensive one. Your slow cheap is actually a channeled, and it's called Soothing Mists. It does like mana per second as you're channeling it, and it does have a chance to generate chi as you're channeling, and it's like a much longer duration than the standard 2.5 for the other healers. And then your big heal, like the equivalent of like a greater heal, or a divine light, is called Enveloping Mists, but here note that Enveloping Mists actually does have a chi cost instead of a mana cost, and it also leaves this lingering hot that increases further cheap heal channels into that target. So, and also note that this spell and the flash heal equivalent, they both are instant casts if you cast them while you're channeling your Soothing Mists. So you're pretty much going to be rolling on the Soothing Mists button for heals and then appropriately using these when necessary. Do note that this fast heal, it is a fast heal by itself, and it will generate chi. So your Soothing Mist 25% chance per tick is not the only thing generating chi. You can always just spam flash heals for chi. But if you are channeling Soothing Mists on a target, this flash heal will automatically go to the target that you're channeling your Soothing Mists on. So if you want to, like, I would say the new thing you want to make is a macro of stop casting macros for each of these spells, so you can either choose to stop your channeling or keep channeling. And note this unique toolkit kind of has a lot of flow together, because these 3 spells, they do sort of go together if you're laying in heals to a person. So it's kind of it's sort of fun to play around with. I would recommend it, like, just to try out, just to see how it plays differently. Now, these charges that you're generating of mana T, every time you dump 4 chi, just like in Windwalker, you get this charge of T. Basically, you can stop healing altogether, like this is a complete stopping of heal, and then you can channel back your mana with these mana T charges. Do note that, like, this is no healing that you're doing while you're channeling, so it's sort of like an active regen that you're playing. You can change it up with a glyph. You can make it an instant cast, and it'll instantly drop 2 charges of T for a nuke of mana back, but that puts a cooldown on the ability. I'd rather just find the time in the fight to channel back these T charges when appropriate. So that's just personal preference, but if you like that, if you need it to be an instant cast nature, you can glyph for it. Now, if you're familiar with Resto Shaman, you should be familiar with keeping Riptide on cooldown. It's like a hot that's super mandatory. Well, in this spec, you have this Renewing Mists 8-second cooldown, and it puts a hot on the target, and it generates chi. So it's a really effective spell that you kind of want to keep on cooldown. The changes between this and like Riptide are, this has 3 charges when you put it on a target, and those charges kind of bounce off to stray targets like Prayer of Mending does if you play a priest. So maximizing the spread of this hot, keep it on cooldown, and you can get that hot to jump to as many targets as possible. Since it generates chi, you can then dump that chi off with this Uplift ability. Uplift will instantly heal everybody who has a hot from that Renewing Mist that jumped around. So it's a really powerful AoE, and if you're keeping up, you kind of have the choice of either dropping that big slow nuke heal, like the greater heal version with chi, or you can use this for AoE healing. If you want to surge in an empowerment to that AoE, you have this cooldown here called Thunder Focus. Basically, it does increase the healing that you do, and it's a 45-second cooldown, so you can use it fairly liberally, but it also causes all of those surging mists that you put out, when you uplift them all, it refreshes the duration of the surging mist. So you can get like a ton of these hots out bouncing around the raid with smart use of that cooldown. And you can get, that's kind of like your response for like AoE in burst if you're proactive. So it's a really unique playstyle. It's a cool spin on hots. I put healing spheres out my bar here to show that you still cast them and they still do more healing in this spec. However, I typically don't do it because it's a mana cost to cast this healing sphere. it's actually baked into our mastery, and the mastery has a chance to trigger it next to targets that you're healing. So I would just save myself the globals and only rely on my mastery to keep those spheres out in the ground for people to walk over. But I mean, if you do want controlled burst of where to positionally place these spheres, you can like pool them up together into a focus location with that spell still. And your primary spam, just like generate chi, forget about AoE, is spinning crane kick. In order to generate chi, it has to hit at least 3 targets, and one of those targets can't be yourself. So it it currently right now is like doing too much healing, so I'm expecting it to still be tweaked around numbers wise, so that the numbers aren't finalized. But essentially, if you're clumped up in a group, you want to be spamming that and generating chi through that method. So you can see here that your chi generators that you have basically are your soothing mists, your slow chi peel, and your renewing mist, which is like your hot you want to be keeping on cooldown. This spec also does a lot of heals generated while doing DPS. So another chi generator that you have is this crackling jade lightning. You can channel that. It does healing to the group, and it still has that chance to proc extra chi. And then you can also use jab. Jab and expel harm, they both generate chi, and since you're in the stance of the wise serpent, you're 100% hit cap from your spirit, and you're also doing, like each time you're doing damage with jab or expel harm, half of that damage is being converted into healing. And pretty much all of your damaging abilities, like for nukes, will be healing the group members nearby, kind of like atonement if you're familiar with discipline priests. You can dump it into your blackout kicks, and here's the cool thing about blackout kicks. Your heals are only being generated if you're doing these damaging abilities. Your auto attacks aren't healing. If you blackout kick twice, 50% of your auto attacks will start doing heal. So you kind of want to, if you're going to be doing this like DPS rotation when healing's really light, you want to keep that blackout kick stacked up to 2. And then the other unique thing that you can juggle with when you're doing your DPS is your Tiger Palm now gives this stacking buff that's eventually, it's like Maelstrom procs for shamans. It's going to eventually make your next flash heal free of cost mana wise, so you and instant. So you can also like juggle that 5 times and then like dump that flash heal appropriately and spot someone if you're managing those kicks with your in between your DPS rotations and your jabs or whatever. Between those abilities and your renewing mist, which is kind of like your riptide, remember you're getting a lot of chi when you're doing like DPS, so it's really nice for saving mana as well, but you can't really sustain that when real healing needs to be done, so that's the catch. Now to create more positional awareness, you have this statue you can lay down. It's pretty cool. When you lay it down, it like your attacks that you're doing that aren't auto attacks will heal the nearby people to it. So if you're in melee range, like pegging away at a boss or whatever, you can like drop this back in the ranged and still keep doing your DPS rotation, and this every time you're doing DPS will start blowing off heals to other people. The other thing it does is when you're soothing mists somebody and the jade statue's down, it also randomly just like it picks, well, it doesn't random, but it picks a target to heal. Right now, I'm the only person in my group right now, so it's picking me every time, but essentially what you can do is get 2 soothing mists, like channeling into people, based on smart placement. Or if you need to super pump heals into a group, like if the melee's taking lots of damage, you can put that positionally in the melee group, and you can soothing mist a melee and have it also soothing mist another melee. So it creates some cool stuff that you can do. If you can be proactive, or if you kind of like know what needs to be healed, and it also covers for you when you're like up in melee range if you're like not hanging back with the rest of the healers. So I don't know, it adds another like mix up to your gameplay, which is neat. So essentially, it can be really easily broken down, the spec, into like 3 modes. If there's really light healing that needs to be done, you can be up and doing DPS in the group. That's like the lightest amount of healing. So do DPS when you're up there. If healing starts to get a little bit more intense, you kind of want to like back off and start doing soothing mists and like being a little bit more intelligent with who you're placing your heals on. And then if healing gets like outrageous, you want to be using your flash heals liberally, and then dumping your greater heals, or like dumping your cooldowns into uplift intelligently to get some max throughput on the group. But I would also say, regardless of rotation, this renewing mists, like your Riptide, you pretty much want to keep that on cooldown, in my opinion. So yeah, try to get that out, as many of those as you can. Now, because it's something you want to keep on cooldown, this glyph is like borderline mandatory for this spec. This increases its jumpage by 40 yards, so I would say regardless, you need to have that glyphed as well, so it's like mandatory. Spinning crane kick's also pretty good to glyph for because you can cover more area without that slow penalty. And Surging Mist is kind of bizarre. You can glyph for it to just be this like heal that smart heals whoever is like lowest. I'd say that's probably good for leveling because you're going to be doing your DPS rotation primarily. So with those 5 Tiger Palm strikes, and it's going to be an instant cast, you can kind of just like fire it and not really pay attention to who you're shooting it onto. But I wouldn't recommend glyphing it for serious play. And then if you noticed, like Chi can be dumped into our finishing DPS moves and our greater heal. It can also be dumped into our uplifts. If you want, you can glyph for uplift to be a mana cost instead of chi. So that's really handy if you want that flexibility, like, and you don't have to pick between AoE or like big slow heal. But primarily I've been running with it unglyphed because it does drain my mana a bit faster, I've noticed. But if you're good at managing your mana with like your T, it's an alternative play style. For your talents, across all the specs, there's a few that stick out. I always pretty much pick Zen Sphere for both Windwalkers and Brewmasters, so hopefully they'll balance that so it's a little bit more of a choice. But I've pretty much, like, that's the one that to get in beta anyway. And then same thing for Power Strikes. That's like the Windwalker, Brewmaster 45 talent you pick. And I've also been picking Leg Sweep pretty much every time for Brewmaster and Dampen Harm for Brewmaster, so wish there was more choice, but that's how I've been doing it. Level 87 you get basically Demonic Teleport that Warlocks have, so that's your new ability to look forward to, and you can minor glyph it to make it look pretty. If you like this vid or others on my site, you can help support me by liking, favoriting, subscribing, and even commenting. I'll try to respond best I can, and thanks for all the support, guys. I really do appreciate it.